Well, good morning, everybody. We'll start.
Good morning.
No further ado. I'm Edna Mcmahon, president of the Empire Center for Public Policy, and on behalf of the center and all of us there, welcome to this discussion this morning. After a long, hard winter, I think you probably agree, there's nothing like a dark and rainy morning to make you aware of infrastructure needs. You know, I was threading my way around the potholes on my way into Albany today, and I couldn't see them as well as usual, so it was a teeth-rattling reminder of what the deal is. But, you know, as you know, this is not just a seasonal challenge. If you look at some of the common stats that the American Society of Civil Engineers cites, 2,169 of the 17,000 bridges in New York are considered structurally deficient, and that's a somewhat larger percentage than the national average. More than a quarter of our bridges are considered functionally obsolete. 60% of our major roads are in poor, obsolete, or mediocre condition. On the local level, the town and county highway superintendents have estimated they've got over $1 billion in unmet needs and catch-up repairs and maintenance that needs to be done to local roads to keep them from becoming deficient. Meanwhile, the state has embarked on one of its biggest, the biggest highway bridge infrastructure project in the state in many years, which is the construction of the new twin spans across the Tappan Zee and the lower Hudson. Although it's still not clear how the entire projected $3.9 billion cost for the project will be financed. Now, for all of these projected needs, it's not as if we're not already coughing up a lot of money for infrastructure. To cite a few statistics with which you also may be familiar, New Yorkers pay the second highest fuel taxes in the country, a little over 68 cents a gallon, which is more than 20 cents more than the national average, largely because we need to support a dedicated highway transportation fund that's been diverted to non-capital operation spending and heavily leveraged, and so produces relatively little for ongoing capital needs. About a quarter of that, of the amount of the well over $3 billion a year raised for the dedicated fund in the coming year will be used for actual capital projects. To comply with its bonding resolutions, the Thruway Authority is in its budget projecting that it's going to raise tolls by 47% in the next 4 years. Now, whether or not that happens, something's going to have to give here. Sooner or later, one way or another, New Yorkers are going to be asked to pay even more than we already do for highways and bridges. But the question that before we get into all that is, are we getting our money's worth to start with? Might we even be getting less than the tax and toll dollars buy in other states? So to frame that issue, we're going to start our discussion this morning with a presentation by Baruch Feigenbaum. Now, Baruch is the Assistant Director of Transportation Policy at the Reason Foundation. Reason's a fairly well-known think tank dedicated, in the words of its motto, to advancing free minds and free markets. Baruch Feigenbaum earned his master's in transportation at Georgia Institute of Technology and has a diverse background researching a wide variety of transportation issues, and his bio is in your packet. He is involved, among other things, he prepares the Reason Foundation's annual Highway Conditions Report, which is a very valuable document that you're now working on the 21st annual?
21st annual.
21st annual. And so, without any further ado, we'll hear a presentation from Baruch Feigenbaum. There you are.
Back it up. Back it up.
Back it up.
Yeah, I think that's the first slide.
Too far out.
There we go.
Ah, there you go. Okay.
All right, and thanks everyone for coming out this morning. And I also want to make sure that I thank EJ and Michael and Missy. You know, working at a state level think tank is challenging. It's a lot of fun, but it's challenging. Resources are often tight, but they do a lot of great work and often unheralded. So if you can support them, if you don't already, that's always a wonderful thing to do. So what I'm going to be talking about this morning is basically New York State highway system. And from the title here, it's basically the theme of the presentation, high cost and limited benefits. And compared to other states, you're going to see that New York is really not maximizing its system like it could be. All right, and so I'm just going to give you a little presentation outline here. We're going to start with the overall rankings, meaning what are the rankings, why do we do them, what do they mean, do we come up with them out of thin air? No, we don't. We're going to talk about how we calculate them as well. I think a lot of times with these technical presentations, people think it's a little bit black box mystical, and so I just want to take that away and show you the transparent system. The latest rankings in terms of where other states are, and looking at New York peer states, oftentimes people will say, when you come up with a state that does very well, such as, say, Wyoming, well, Wyoming is nothing like New York, and Wyoming is very different from New York, but there are states similar to New York that actually do substantially better. And we're also going to look, lastly, a little bit, and the rest of the panel here is going to touch on this a little bit more, but how New York can reduce expenses and improve system conditions. Okay, so as EJ mentioned, this is the 21st Annual Hire Report. What we do is we use Federal Highway Administration data for 9 measures, and I'm going to cover them shortly, and we use Texas A&M Transportation Institute data, their Urban Mobility Report, for the other. For the other. And the reason we do that's actually 10 measures from Federal Highway, The reason we do that is because Federal Highway no longer gives us good congestion data. We used to use their congestion data, but some of the factors they're putting in now cause it to be a little bit weird in our sense. So we went ahead and switched over. We just think it's a little bit better. The data is self-reported and audited by the Federal Highway Administration. So you might be thinking, well, some of these states are just lying. You know, they're just giving fake data. And the answer is they're not, because if they were caught, and Federal Highway actually has a pretty good system here, they would lose all their federal highway funds. And no state's going to risk that. Of the 11 measures, 4 measure disbursements, which is the amount the state spends, 3 measure pavement conditions, 3 measure safety, and 1 measures congestion. And sometimes people will ask, well, where do you come up with these numbers? Well, in an ideal world, we do an equal amount that measure disbursements and an equal amount that measure pavement condition. But we found out for various reasons that 4 and 7 seems to give a more balanced picture. When we used an equal amount, we found out that a lot of the rural states would benefit, and for various reasons, we find this to give a fairer picture. Okay, just a little bit more. 1 is the best ranking, 50th is the worst. Some rather maybe obvious statements. States that rank the highest have a system in good condition with low levels of traffic congestion and low overall costs, whereas states that rank the lowest have a system in poor condition with high levels of traffic congestion, high overall costs. The states in the middle are in the middle of that. Okay, so what we do is we calculate a raw composite score in each of 11 categories. And we use that score to develop a rating in one category and then an overall rating. So for example, we're coming up with a numerical score, we're comparing that against the states, and then for the final total score, we're adding those component scores together. And everything is a percentage based. So for example, when I talk about deficient bridges, that's the percent of deficient bridges, not the number of deficient bridges, because obviously if it was number, a larger state would tend to fare worse. Okay, so just a little bit here with a sample score. So if it's urban interstate congestion, I've pulled a few New York numbers here, we have 10.53% of the system is in poor condition. And you might say to yourself, well, it seems to me like a lot more of the system is in poor condition. Well, to be in poor condition, it's got to be pretty bad. We're talking about noticeable potholes, we're talking about a really rough ride. Fair condition is not very good either. So that 10.53 is the 45th lowest in the country, or excuse me, 45th, yeah, it's 45th worst in the country is basically what we're saying. So that makes New York 45th. And then for fatality rates, New York's fatality rate is actually pretty good. It's 0.91 people per 100 million vehicle miles. And so that 0.91 is the 11th lowest in the country, so that is good. So that means New York ranks 11th. Okay, so there's good news and bad news. The good news is New York has actually improved. They've improved so much, I put it in twice since last year. The bad news is the state still ranks in the bottom 10. And the best ranking fatality rating is 11th. The worst is deficient bridges at 49. And we're going to talk about that. So the ranking this year is 43rd. That's an increase from 45 2 years ago and 44 last year. So if New York keeps moving up 1 spot every year, I don't know, about 2050, I guess, might get to number 1. All right, so here is an overall chart. And let me just explain what's going on here. This first column is the actual rankings in each of the 11 categories in the overall. The second category is the ratio to the U.S. So what's the ratio to the U.S.? The ratio is where New York ranks compared to other states, average being 1. So if 1 is the middle between the best and the worst, this is where New York ranks. If you're less than 1, that means you're in good shape. If you're above 1, that means you're in bad shape. So you can see some of these rankings are bad, and some of them are really bad, to be honest with you. So for example, I'm not going to read them all, you can see them, but maintenance disbursements 47, that's 3.52. That means for every dollar that the average state spends on maintenance, New York spends $3.52. Let's look at some of the other ones. Deficient bridges at the bottom there, 49. So that 1.80 is not as bad, but obviously being second to last in percentage of deficient bridges is not good. I'm going to move on here and, whoops, go back here, and just basically show you the best, because some people say, well, you know, it's only a few states, it's, you know, states that are different and special. And as you can see, you look at this category, there is a number of different states that are the best. Overall is Wyoming. Admittedly, Wyoming is not New York, but for capital and bridge disbursements, you've got Virginia, another state with a relatively high population center around northern Virginia and Richmond. You've got, for maintenance disbursements, New Mexico, sort of a random. For rural interstate condition, you've got a number of states there, including Illinois, a state that I would argue is quite similar to New York, that actually have 0% of their miles that are rural deficient. That's why we're talking about that. For fatality rate, you've got Massachusetts, not surprising. States in the Northeast tend to do well with that. And then for deficient bridges, you've got California, which I would hardly call a model of doing much of anything right in transportation. So you really have a range here. Now for the worst, well, interestingly enough, this tends to be a very few states. You can see led by Hawaii and New Jersey. I will tell you, I'm originally from New Jersey, so I have no pride in saying New Jersey is last, but you can see there's some pretty crazy numbers here. So that means total disbursements for every dollar that the average state spends on their highway system, New Jersey spends $12.50. And you might say to yourself, that's unbelievable. Is that really true? Maybe the data is wrong. I went back and checked it several times. I couldn't believe it either. And the answer is yes. And so again, depending on the category, you're talking about the safety categories, which I would say are things like fatality rate, narrow rural lanes. You tend to get, especially with fatality rate, your more rural states. You're talking about congestion, you tend to get your more urban states. You've got a place like Florida, which has got a lot of centers of population. And then you've got your outliers like Alaska and Hawaii, who should be doing better than this, but obviously they're sort of unique. Okay, so in a nutshell here, New York spends a lot. That's $462,098 per state-controlled mile of highway, yet has a poor highway system. And so the question we want to ask is why, and more importantly, what states similar to New York are doing better? All right. Before I do that, I just want to get through these common complaints with the highway rankings, because sometimes people will say, oh, you know, your rankings aren't fair. So states with the lower populations tend to rank higher than states with higher populations, the frequent complaint. And the reality is low population states do cluster near the top, but the outliers, including Alaska, Vermont, and Delaware, Vermont's the least populated state now, Alaska's 48th, are all in the bottom 14. We also get high population states cluster near the bottom. Again, outliers, Texas, Georgia, and Ohio, another state which is similar to New York, are all in the top 14. And so, do low population, less urbanized states have an advantage? Maybe slightly, but it certainly doesn't explain a rating in the bottom 10. Okay, so in order to be fair, what I wanted to do was look at another way of ranking, and look at New York's peer states. And so I selected states that are similar to New York in various characteristics. So first I wanted a state with a high population. So I took the population rank all in the top 10. I also wanted a state with a similar land rank, and what I meant by that is I didn't want a really small state like Rhode Island and New Jersey, or a really big state like Texas or California. The other thing I wanted was a state with a similar density, meaning the number of people per square mile, and you can see that's pretty similar there. And the other thing I wanted was an urban-rural split. And what I mean by that is, in New York, you've got a lot of your population in New York City, and then lesser upstate, Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Albany. And that's similar to these other places. Illinois, for example, a lot of population in Chicago, less. Michigan, Detroit, less. And so that's what we're going for. So I really wanted to find states that were comparative and say, what are these states doing that New York is not? All right. And so the question is, do they rank better? And the answer is, yes, they do. There are the overall rankings. You can see Ohio ranks significantly better. Pennsylvania ranks only a little bit better. The reason I pulled Pennsylvania was because Pennsylvania for the longest time had a rap of being one of the worst, especially in terms of deficient bridges. Pennsylvania at one point in time had twice the percentage of deficient bridges as everyone else. Pennsylvania now has a smaller percentage of deficient bridges than New York. And then Ohio is the best, so again, what is Ohio doing right? All right, just again, more tables here, just to show you the difference between New York's rankings and the other overall, and you can see generally the other states are all ranking better. You know, New York, a lot of 40s, 30s, 120, 111. This is another way to do it, and I really like this chart. What I did here is I showed the categories that these other states are better than New York in, and the categories that New York is, or that these other states are worse. And as you can see, with the exception of fatality rate and a few other categories, there's, let's see here, I have 12, there's 48 squares here. So of those 48, 9, I did my math right, something around there, are red and the rest are green, which means these states are better than New York in all of the green boxes, which is a lot more categories than New York is better than them. All right, and so why costs vary? And again, there's a lot of different things, and you can't blame just one thing, but we're looking for patterns here. Okay, so it's not entirely weather. We'll get a lot of complaints, it's the freeze-thaw cycle. Yes, that's a factor. No, it's not totally the factor. Or a state like North Dakota would not have a good ranking. Yet we're also potentially looking at doing a study of this in 2015 to get a real in-depth answer. But I'm going to try to give you a potential list right now that goes ahead and says this. Okay, so first of all, let's look at overall disbursements. So I have what I can call controllable and uncontrollable. So one of the things that these other states have that New York doesn't is what I call a flatter administration. Fewer levels, and also fewer people at each level. And Ohio and Michigan are particularly good at this. We also see a lot of states outsourcing maintenance costs and doing a little bit more competitive bidding. Unions an issue in all of these states to a certain degree. One of the things we find that works really well is states that have divisions, and the folks in those divisions actually allow a little more autonomy and a little more creativity. And what that means is if there's a division upstate that sort of has pioneered a practice that's particularly good in terms of improving their pavement condition, that division is allowed to do that with a little more freedom from New York State DOT in general. And we find that sort of allowing these divisions to tinker actually comes up with some really good results. Also, interestingly enough, non-modal organization. Now, what am I talking about there? Many state DOTs are organized. You've got highways, you've got transit, you've got ferries, you've got aviation, you've got a lot of different categories. There are advantages to having it that way. There are also advantages to having a flatter organization. Cost-wise, the flatter organization, and in this case I mean not having the modals, having highway and transit, these others together, seems to be cheaper. Now, a lot of folks would argue you have modals, it's more effective, so it's kind of a trade-off. And the uncontrollable one in some ways is the cost of living. So for example, if it costs more to maintain a highway here for whatever the reason, because of the cost of concrete, then that's something that you want to go ahead and take into consideration as well. Looking a little bit at road quality. Okay, so again, controllable. The states with the better system tend to be much more into regular maintenance and a shorter maintenance cycle, meaning improving, repaving their roads every 5 years as opposed to every 10 years. It is cheaper to make regular improvements than it is to do a major reconstruction, even if you're doing it at 2 or 3 times as often. Specialized department. So what that means is if there is a specialized unit that focuses just on road maintenance, Ohio has this, Georgia also has this. I would say Georgia's obviously not got some of the union issues, but it is similar in terms of population, 8th largest in the country. They perennially have #1 in terms of road condition. Truck restrictions. Okay, so trucks are very important to development and also important to a way of life, but they do wear roads faster than cars, and in some situations, especially in urban areas, restricting your trucks on certain roads can actually be a good decision. Obviously not all of them, certain ones. And we also find that states with fewer but wider highways rank better. This is another thing I wouldn't necessarily recommend. You want a robust highway system, but for whatever the reason, because of economies of scale, you have a 12-lane road that's going to be a little cheaper to maintain than or a little cheaper to keep good quality than a 6-lane road. The uncontrollables here are the weather, the freeze-thaw cycle, and topography. If you've got mountains, that tends to increase your costs. Okay, congestion. So again, a list of controllable and not controllable. Controllable would be what I call is a grid network of highways, which is what I was just talking about, having a parallel system of east, west, and north-south roads. The reason for that is the more ways you go through, the more options you have, the more congestion tends to be reduced. If you've just got one major road and you particularly have an accident on it, you're going to have a lot of problems if there's not another way to get around. Priced roads, and we've got the turnpike system here, thruway system, excuse me. Those also tend to help because we find they reduce optional trips that people don't really need to take. There's some debate there. The needs over politics, okay, so this is always a tricky one. If the governor wants, for example, a road in a specific area, the governor would tend to get that road, and that's in all states, not just New York. But if the state DOT folks are actually doing the math and figuring out where the road goes, that's obviously going to be a savings and that's obviously going to be better in congestion because it's actually solving a problem. And how much funding and where it's spent. Where it's spent is more important than how much funding. A lot of states have certain funding targets for certain areas, and oftentimes we find that's more for political reasons. It's better to spend the funds where the funds are needed, but depending on where influential politicians are based, that might not be realistic. Uncontrollable rate of population increase in existing congestion. And interestingly enough, New York does much better in congestion than I would have thought. I suspect because a lot of it is downstate, the severe congestion, upstate not as much. Okay, and I think this is my last slide. I want to talk a little bit about safety. Another category where New York does fairly well, but it could do better. It's really hit and miss. On the fatality rate, New York does really, really well. But on some of the other categories, specifically the arterial narrow bridges, not as well. So one of the things that Pennsylvania did that is really helpful in their bridge results, and we're not actually seeing the results in this survey, but we will a few years down the road, is they did a bundled P3 maintenance project, and they did it just for their bridges. Because they said, how are we going to solve the problem? How are we going to improve our bridges that are just the worst in the country? And they found they were able to get economies of scale by putting small bridges and large bridges together and actually bundling the entire contract out. So the private sector, the advantage to the state was the private sector had a package that they had. So there wasn't the tendency to sort of pick the best projects. And the benefit to the private sector was they had a whole list of projects. So they could really come up with, they could really take advantage of their economies of scale and take advantage of different methods in order to get these bridges in the best conditions. Narrow lanes, again, modernizing and widening the road, that's really just doing it. It's not terribly challenging. States in the West generally tend to have better roads. They tend to be a little wider because they were built later. Fatality rate, most of the factors there, New York does well in this. Drunk driving, Utah, for example, has a very low fatality rate. Windy roads, not windy roads, although windy wouldn't be bad either. And speed limit. Generally, I am a fan of the 85th percentile speed limit and setting the speed limit the way cars are actually traveling, but lower speed limits do tend to improve safety. And the uncontrollable here with the deficient bridges is the age of the bridge, can't control that, the age of the roadway in terms of the narrow lanes, again, it was built earlier, and the fatality rate, rural versus urban. So, and there is my title. And I have a bunch of cards, and I will talk to you later, and I'm sure we'll take questions later.
I mean, we could probably do some now for you, and then
sure.
the panel will be
Sure.
separate.
Okay.
And I'll start with one, because we weren't able to reproduce the latest report because it's not issued yet.
Right, that's, yeah.
Can you, and I'm sorry, I didn't put a slip in there saying this, the web address for the Reason Highway Conditions Report, do you have that? Reason.org, and
It's
is there a...
reason.org, and we change it. We change it every year. Is the answer?
Okay.
It's the 21st one. If you go to our website, it should be out the week before Memorial Day. That's our goal. We like to put it out. Memorial Day is a good hook from the media perspective because it's the start of the summer driving season. It'll be 21st annual highway report, and it will be prominently placed.
Now, a question for you. I don't know if you can toggle back a little
Sure.
bit. What was our expenditure per mile figure? And I wanted to ask you, I don't think what was next to it. What was our expenditure per mile overall, and what was the national that we were comparing to?
Let's see here. So,
I you had 400 some odd thousand, I believe.
Right, some 400,000. The national is generally around 200 and change.
Right.
So we're generally talking about double.
So it's about 190,000 or $200,000 more per mile
Yes,
that we're spending
Yes.
than the national average.
yes.
Did you have the Ohio figure, because you were talking about Ohio and Illinois figures on that?
Off the top of my head, the Illinois figure is about at that 100 and is about 200. The Ohio figure is actually about 140.
Okay.
And again, it's a good point. I could have had those, but it's a substantial difference.
So we're $200,000 more per mile than Ohio or Illinois?
Yes. And I don't think most people would consider Illinois a model of great government at work, shall I say?
And you're convinced they're not cheating on what they send the feds on the terms of the data?
Right, because that's what a lot of people ask us, because they say, well, those Chicago politicians. But I will say this is actually put in by Illinois DOT at Springfield, so assuming that, there's nothing shady going on. And again, Illinois is not going to risk losing its highway funding. That really is a big deal. I will tell you that because of environmental reasons, Atlanta in the late 90s lost its highway funding, and that was a disaster for Atlanta, of which they still have not recovered in terms of congestion. So no one is going to risk that.
No, they need business.
Yeah.
Any other questions on the reason report? Yeah, County Executive Jimino, you had a question?
Do you look at all at the participation of local governments with state governments in either the cost factors or some of the things you just mentioned, for instance, in packaging projects together? Do any of the states do that with their local government?
So that's actually a great question to bring up. The answer is yes, some of them do. We look at the state-controlled system. Now, the state-controlled system varies by state. Some states, I want to use North Carolina as an example. North Carolina actually has the second largest state-controlled system after Texas, because every road is a state road, except for the local roads. Whereas other states, and New York is among this, tend to have more of a state-county split. So sometimes the states and the counties will work together. A lot of times the state will actually pass down money down to the county and have specific instructions for how to do things. So there's really no conclusion one way or the other whether it works better for the state and county system. I suspect it probably does, just because if the state has the whole system, there's more economies of scale, whereas if it's a state and county, it doesn't. So you would then expect the systems that are all state controlled to come out cheaper and better, and they don't. So my suspicion is yes, it is, but we have not looked at that specifically.
Another question, Walt?
In terms of cost per mile, do you look at whether it's a full road reconstruction or is it just an overlay? Do you take that into consideration in terms of your cost per mile figure?
We do. The cost per mile is an overall, and again, it's one of those figures that we mean. So we take the average of reconstruction, we take the average of maintenance, we take the average of all of them. We also use administrative costs. So yeah, we take that and we weight it and we percentage it, and that's how we come with that overall figure. And again, depending on the amount of reconstruction a state might be doing each year, that number can go up and down, but we found that New York is actually pretty consistent at that number.
Okay. Other questions for yes?
Can you tell me what's included in the administrative disbursements? Is that mostly like administering the programs in the state? Is that where that number comes from?
That is correct. That is the actual administrative costs of the programs, the sort of back office support.
So that doesn't include construction and the maintenance?
That is not, so right, so the capital and bridge disbursements is generally construction. The maintenance disbursements is general regular maintenance. The administrative disbursements is purely the administrative functions for doing the rest of the state highway system.
Is labor part of construction? Is that how you calculate it?
Labor is considered part of construction, yes. Labor would be factored in both capital and bridge and maintenance, because there's labor in both of those. Labor would not be an administrative.
Except the labor costs of the state.
Yeah, well, right,
Working
the state workers, yeah, exactly.
Okay. Julia had a question, and then we'll go on to the two. Go ahead.
Two brief clarification points on New York State being the worst in the country. So, on when it's
43rd.
So,
43rd.
43rd. When it's 45th was for what?
45th was urban interstate condition, and that means the overall pavement quality. and it was also 45th 2 years ago. So, or it was 2009, it was 45th. Again, we have to work with when we get the federal highway data.
Well, it
and
probably
there's
hasn't gotten better.
Right, I mean, well,
Yeah.
it's 45th in 2009, it's 43rd in 2000, and these are 12 numbers.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And then, when you're looking at this data and you're trying to explain to citizens why the data matters, what would you say is the most important calculation for a citizen trying to understand where its state is on highway conditions?
That is a good question. What I usually tell folks is that you're looking at the overall snapshot, and so you're looking at the overall rankings. You don't want to get too obsessed with any one ranking. So, for example, if you're in a rural state, your fatality rate is going to be worse. You want it to be better. Obviously, you want a low number of fatalities. But what you're looking at is the overall picture. And the lower the ranking you have, it means the more money you're spending to get a worse system. So it's a double negative. The states that rank the best spend very little and have a good system. The states that rank the worst spend a lot and have a bad system. And obviously some states, New York is never going to be number one. That is not what I'm saying. We're not trying to get New York to be number one. We are trying to get New York to be 25, which is an achievable goal. It really is, because if Ohio can be 14, and Michigan can be 25, and Illinois can be, or Illinois is 25, I don't know, New York can be 25. That's what we're trying to do.
So that would be, and thank you very much, Bruce, which would be a couple $100,000 less per mile. Although, to clarify before we go into our panel, this is not just an expenditure index, this is it's a cost effectiveness index.
Right, exactly.
Which is why I think it's one of the things that always catches my interest about it, I know. Well, thank you very much, and we'll have